Halloween night had always been a big deal in my neighborhood. Every house decorated to the nines, kids running from door to door, and parents standing in driveways chatting. This year, I decided to hand out candy alone, enjoying the eerie quiet that settled after the trick-or-treaters came and went. It was getting late, nearly 10 p.m., and I figured it was about time to call it a night. I still had half a bowl of candy left, but most of the younger kids were probably already in bed. I shut off the front porch light and started cleaning up the decorations in the yard. That's when I saw him, a boy, standing just beyond the glow of the streetlight. He was small, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing a plain, old-fashioned mask that covered his face. The mask was white with hollow eyes and a thin slit for a mouth, something straight out of a 50s horror movie. His costume was odd too, just a ragged shirt and pants, dirt-stained and worn. He didn't move, just stared at me from the edge of my lawn. "Hey, buddy! Halloween's over!" I called out. "I don't have any candy left." No response. I started to feel uneasy, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was waiting for a parent. I turned to head back inside, but something made me glance over my shoulder. He was closer now, just a few feet from my porch, standing perfectly still. The mask's hollow eyes seemed to watch me intently. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "All right, that's enough," I said, more firmly this time. "Where are your parents?" Again, no answer. I took a step back, my heart racing. The porch light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the yard. The boy took another step closer, his small hands hanging limply at his sides. There was something wrong about the way he moved. Slow, deliberate, almost mechanical. I swallowed the lump in my throat and went inside, locking the door behind me. Through the window, I could see him standing there, completely still. I closed the blinds, trying to shake the growing fear. Minutes passed. I peeked outside again, hoping he'd be gone. He wasn't. He was on the porch now, his face pressed against the window, the hollow eyes of the mask staring in at me. My stomach turned. How had he gotten so close without me hearing? My phone was in my pocket. I fumbled to unlock it, dialing the local non-emergency number. "There's a kid on my porch," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "He won't leave. I think something's wrong with him." The dispatcher asked for my address and promised to send someone, but as soon as I hung up, there was a soft knock at the door. I didn't move. The boy stood on the other side of the door, perfectly still. He raised his hand and knocked again. A deep dread settled over me. Something was off. This wasn't a prank, and this kid wasn't looking for candy. Just as I was about to call again, there was a flash of red and blue lights outside. I heard the sound of a car door closing and footsteps coming up the path. I let out a sigh of relief and opened the door just a crack, expecting to see the officer. But the boy was gone. The officer approached me, looking confused. I told him about the kid, described the mask and the strange, silent behavior. "We'll take a look around," he said, "but no one should be out here this late." They searched the neighborhood, but found nothing. The officer reassured me it was probably just a kid playing a Halloween prank. I tried to believe him, but as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that those hollow eyes were still watching me from somewhere out in the dark. Halloween was always the best night of the year for me. I loved dressing up, running around the neighborhood with my friends, and filling my pillowcase with as much candy as possible. I'd been trick-or-treating since I could walk, and every year we had a tradition. Hit every house in the neighborhood. No exceptions. Except for one. The last house on Maple Street was always off limits. It was old, run down, and no one ever saw anyone come in or out. The windows were boarded up, the yard overgrown with weeds, and even the streetlight in front of it flickered as if it was barely clinging to life. The kids at school called it the witch house because, well, that's what everyone assumed lived there. A witch, or something worse. But this year, something felt different. It was my last year going trick-or-treating. Next Halloween, I'd be too old. My friends, Tommy and Jake, and I had already cleaned up most of the neighborhood. Our bags were heavy with candy, and we were talking about heading home when I stopped at the bottom of Maple Street, staring up at the witch house. "Let's do it," I said suddenly, surprising even myself. "Do what?" Tommy asked, looking confused. "The witch house. Come on, it's our last year. Don't you want to see what happens?" Jake snorted. "Dude, it's probably empty. Besides, what if it really is a witch? You want to get cursed or something?" I shrugged. "What's the worst that could happen? It's just one house." Tommy hesitated, glancing nervously up at the dark silhouette of the house. "I don't know, man. It's kind of creepy." "That's the point," I said with a grin, already walking toward it. "Come on, you scared or something?" Neither of them answered, but I could hear their footsteps following behind me as we headed up the street. The air felt colder here, like the temperature had dropped just on this block. The closer we got to the house, the more I felt that uneasy knot forming in my stomach, but I ignored it. I didn't want to look scared in front of my friends. When we reached the front gate, I noticed the gate was hanging on by one rusty hinge, barely holding together. The overgrown path leading up to the porch was cracked, and the house itself loomed above us like a dark, forgotten shadow. No lights, no decorations, no sign of life. "Well, go ahead," Jake said, nudging me. "You're the one who wanted to do this." I swallowed, walking up to the door. The wood was weathered and rotting, the paint long faded to a sickly gray. I raised my hand to knock, but hesitated for just a second. What if someone was actually inside? I shook off the thought and knocked. We waited. At first, there was nothing, just the sound of the wind blowing through the dead branches of the trees, and the distant laughter of other kids trick-or-treating further down the street. Then, I heard it. A faint creak from inside the house. I took a step back, looking at Tommy and Jake. They stared at me, eyes wide. Another creak, this one louder, closer. It was coming from behind the door. Suddenly, the door swung open. We all jumped back, our hearts pounding. But there was no one there. Just the dark, empty hallway beyond the threshold. The air smelled musty, like the inside of an old attic that hadn't been opened in decades. "I don't like this," Tommy muttered, taking a step back. Before I could respond, something caught my eye. At the far end of the hallway, I saw a movement. A shadow, faint but unmistakable, slipping out of sight around the corner. My breath caught in my throat. "Did you see that?" I whispered. "What?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper now. "There's someone in there," I said, pointing toward the dark hallway. "We should leave," Tommy said quickly, already backing toward the street. But I couldn't stop staring. I took a step closer to the door, peering into the darkness. The shadow moved again, this time closer, gliding silently toward us. I took another step back, my heart hammering in my chest. "We need to go." But as I turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my bag of candy. The sound echoed through the night, and the three of us froze in place. Suddenly, from the other side of the door, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the creaky floorboards, coming closer to the door. "We need to get out of here," Jake hissed, his voice shaking now. We turned and ran, sprinting down the path, through the broken gate, and into the street without looking back. My legs felt like jelly, and my chest ached from the sudden burst of fear. We didn't stop running until we were halfway down the block, panting and out of breath. "That was messed up," Tommy gasped, leaning over with his hands on his knees. "What the hell was that?" I looked back up the street toward the house. The door was still shut and the streetlight above it flickered weakly. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us from inside, hidden just behind the dark windows. "I don't know," I muttered, my hands trembling. "But I'm not going near that place again." None of us spoke as we walked home, the weight of what had just happened hanging over us like a cloud. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't stop thinking about that shadow, the footsteps, and the way the door had slammed shut as if something, or someone wanted to trap us inside. It wasn't until the next day that I learned the truth. I overheard my parents talking about the old house at the end of Maple Street. Apparently no one had lived there for years. The last family that did had moved out after their son had gone missing one Halloween night. The weirdest part? It happened exactly 20 years ago, to the day. Halloween had always been one of my favorite nights of the year. My house was decked out in decorations and I was just sitting on the couch, waiting for trick-or-treaters to come by. I loved seeing the little kids in their costumes, and I had a massive bowl of candy ready by the door. It was still early in the evening and I was mindlessly flipping through channels when the doorbell rang. Excited, I grabbed the candy and went to the door. There was a group of kids, vampires, witches, a couple of superheroes. "Trick or treat!" they yelled in unison, and I grinned as I handed out handfuls of candy. After they left, I went back to the couch, thinking it was going to be a typical Halloween night. But about 20 minutes later, I noticed something strange. From my living room, I could see the front yard through a large window, and there, standing just outside the window, was someone staring in. At first, I thought it was just another trick-or-treater. Maybe they were waiting for their friends or something. But after a minute, they didn't move. They just stood there, watching me. I squinted, trying to make out their costume, but it was hard to see in the dark. The figure was tall, dressed in a tattered black cloak that draped down to the ground. The mask, though, that's what unnerved me. It wasn't a typical Halloween mask. It looked more like a distorted, almost grotesque face, pale and cracked like decaying porcelain. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to laugh it off. "Nice costume," I muttered to myself, figuring they were just trying to scare me. But they didn't leave. Minutes passed and the figure stayed rooted in place. Now I was starting to feel a bit creeped out. I decided to open the door and tell them to move along, but when I did, the figure was gone. The yard was empty. I stepped outside, looking around the front yard and down the street, but there was no sign of them. Weird, I thought. But maybe they were just some kid playing a prank. I went back inside, locked the door behind me, and tried to shake it off. But something still felt off and I couldn't relax. I glanced back at the window, half expecting to see the figure again. But the yard was empty. An hour passed, and I was still on edge, waiting for something to happen. That's when I heard the noise, a soft tapping sound like fingernails drumming against glass. My heart sank. It was coming from the back of the house. I slowly made my way to the back door, which had a large glass window, and froze. Standing there just beyond the glass was the same figure, only now I could see them more clearly. Their face was pressed up against the window, the mask even more disturbing up close. Its features twisted into a permanent, demented grin, and behind the mask I could see their eyes staring right into mine. I backed away, heart racing. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but when I looked back up, the figure was gone again. It didn't make sense. I hadn't heard them leave, and there was no way they could have disappeared that fast. I checked the lock on the back door, double-checking that it was secure. My fingers were shaking as I dialed 911, explaining to the operator what was happening. They said they'd send someone over to check it out. I sat in the living room, waiting for the police, glancing back at the windows every few seconds. I kept expecting to see that twisted face staring in at me again, but the yard stayed empty. Eventually, the police arrived. I told them everything. About the figure, the mask, how they'd been staring at me from both the front and back of the house. The officers looked around the property, shining their flashlights into every dark corner of the yard. They didn't find anyone, and there were no signs of forced entry. One of them suggested it might have been a prank, a kid in a costume messing around on Halloween. But I wasn't convinced. They left after checking the neighborhood, assuring me they'd patrol the area for the rest of the night. I locked all the doors and windows, trying to calm myself down. I kept telling myself it was over, that the figure was gone. Maybe it really had just been some kid pulling a sick joke. Hours passed, and the night grew quieter. No more trick-or-treaters came by, and I was starting to feel foolish for being so paranoid. I got ready for bed, but before I turned off the lights, I took one last look out the window. The yard was empty and everything seemed normal again. Relieved, I turned away and climbed into bed. But just as I was about to drift off to sleep, there was another sound. A faint creak coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. My blood went cold. I didn't want to look, but I forced myself to, slowly turning my head toward the bedroom door. And there, standing in the doorway, was the same figure. The mask, the cloak, everything. Only this time, they weren't outside. They were in my house. I screamed, grabbing my phone and fumbling to turn on the flashlight. But the moment the light hit the doorway, the figure vanished. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed up a bag and left the house. I didn't care if it was a prank, a hallucination, or something worse. I wasn't going to stay in that house one more night.